Welcome to Fireside Casebook. Come in. There's another mystery waiting by the fire.
Chapter 1. A Sassenach in a yellow jacket, the wind howling off the sea, lock at Lochdebuff, was not a polite, whistling breeze. It was a vicious, wet assault that felt like being repeatedly slapped in the face with a frozen haddock. It was the sort of weather that made sensible people lock their doors, build up the peat fire, and pour a stiff measure of whiskey. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, however, was currently wrestling with a dilapidated Land Rover, trying to convince the engine to turn over while his dog, Lugs, watched him from the passenger seat with an expression of profound canine pity. I know, Hamish muttered to the mongrel, pulling his collar up around his neck. His fiery red hair was plastered to his forehead, and his long, lanky frame shivered beneath his police tunic. But if we stay in the station, Blair is going to ring. I can feel it in my bones. Detective Chief Inspector Blair of Strathbane was the bane of Hamish's existence. A loud, belligerent man with a face like a boiled ham and a temper to match. Blair was likely looking to drag Hamish into some tedious paperwork regarding a stolen bicycle in Breaky. To avoid this terrible fate, Hamish had thrown a damp tea towel over the ringing telephone and made a swift retreat. Giving up on the Land Rover, Hamish decided a patrol was in order. Specifically, a foot patrol that ended exactly where it always did on a morning like this, the warmth of the Tommel Castle Hotel, where he could successfully mooch a cup of coffee and perhaps a bacon roll. He shambled down the waterfront, his hands thrust deep into his pockets, cultivating his best impression of a gormless, lazy Highlander. It was a disguise he wore like a comfortable old sweater. To the outside world, Hamish Macbeth was a slow-witted, unambitious village bobby. Only a very few people knew that behind his hazel eyes lay a sharp, calculating mind that simply preferred an easy life over a stressful promotion. If headquarters in Strathbane ever realized how capable he actually was, they would drag him to the city, force him into a suit, and take away his mountains. Hamish would rather die. Pushing through the heavy oak doors of the Tommel Castle Hotel, Hamish was greeted by a blast of glorious central heating and the scent of roasting coffee. He shook the rain from his coat, commanded Lugs to sit by the grand fireplace, and ambled toward the reception desk. Before he could offer a soft good morning to Mr. Wellington, the hotel manager, his peace was entirely shattered. "I don't think you understand the concept of high-speed internet, my good man," barked a voice that cut through the quiet lobby like a buzzsaw. "I'm running 3 startups from a laptop, and your Wi-Fi is moving at the speed of a dying snail." Hamish paused, leaning lazily against a marble pillar to observe the source of the noise. The man was a quintessential Sassenach, an English outsider, or worse, a Londoner with too much money and zero understanding of the Highlands. He was dressed for a Himalayan expedition rather than a Scottish morning, sporting a blindingly yellow, high-tech waterproof jacket that had never seen a speck of actual mud, expensive fitted hiking trousers, and boots that cost more than Hamish made in a month. He was in his early 40s with a harsh, aggressively tanned face and hair slicked back with some sort of expensive gel. "I apologize, Mr. Vance," Mr. Wellington said, his voice straining with the polite patience of a man dealing with a toddler, "but the storm has knocked out the main line near the pass. It is out of our hands." "Unacceptable," Julian Vance snapped, tapping a £1,000 smartphone impatiently against the mahogany desk. "I bought the Stag Hill property for its isolation. Yes, but not to be cut off from the 21st century. And another thing, those local sheep, they are constantly wandering onto my land. I'm putting up a 6-foot electric fence tomorrow." "I won't have it," Mr. Wellington blanched. "Stag Hill. But Mr. Vance, there is a traditional crofter's right-of-way straight through the lower field. There, you cannot fence it off." "Watch me," Vance sneered, pivoting on his heel. He nearly collided with Hamish, who was standing there looking vacant, tall, and exceptionally damp. Vance looked the village policeman up and down, his nose wrinkling as if he had just stepped in something unpleasant. He took in the slightly frayed uniform, the unkempt red hair, and the gentle, almost vacant smile on Hamish's face. "Excuse me," Vance said, his tone dripping with condescension. Are you the local constabulary or just the village idiot? Oh, a bit of both, sir, Hamish replied smoothly, his Highland lilt thickening into a soft, slow drawl. Constable Hamish Macbeth. Welcome to Lochdebuff. You'll be the one who bought old man MacLean's ruined cottage. It's not a ruin anymore, Constable. I'm transforming it into a modern eco-fortress. Cost me $500,000 to renovate. Not that I'd expect you to understand architecture, Vance puffed his chest out. Since you're here, I want to report a nuisance. The locals keep staring at my property, and a sheep left droppings on my gravel driveway. Do something about it. Hamish blinked slowly, letting a long, agonizing silence stretch between them. He scratched his chin. The sheep have now I read the property deeds, Mr. Vance. They're terrible with paperwork. But I'll be sure to have a stern word with them if I see them loitering. Vance's face reddened. He couldn't quite tell if the policeman was mocking him or genuinely stupid. He opted for the latter. Just ensure my boundaries are respected. I didn't come to this godforsaken swamp to make friends. With a final disdainful glare at Lugs, who let out a low, rumbling growl from the hearth, Vance stormed out of the hotel, throwing the heavy doors open and stepping out into the freezing rain. Hamish watched him go, dropping the vacant smile. His eyes narrowed slightly. Charming fellow, Mr. Wellington sighed, wiping a hand over his forehead. He's been here 3 days while the paint dries at his cottage, and he's already threatened to sue the grocer, insulted the minister, and yelled at the local children for making too much noise on the beach. He's putting up a fence on the right-of-way, is he? Hamish murmured, drifting toward the coffee urn. He says he is. The Crofters are furious. Archie MacLean was in the pub last night saying if Vance blocks that path, he'll tear the fence down with his bare hands. Hamish poured himself a large mug of coffee, adding 3 generous spoonfuls of sugar. A Sassenach with too much money, an arrogant attitude, and a talent for making enemies out of quiet, proud Highlanders. It was a recipe for disaster. Well, Hamish said softly, taking a sip and savouring the warmth. Let us hope Mr. Vance learns some Highland manners soon. People who build fortresses in Lochdebuff often find out the hard way that they've only locked themselves in. He settled into a deep armchair by the fire, tossing a piece of shortbread to Lugs. For now he was warm, the coffee was good, and DCI Blair was miles away. But as he listened to the wind howling against the hotel windows, Hamish couldn't shake the creeping sensation that his peaceful, lazy week was about to come to a very abrupt, very violent end. Chapter 2. The Turnip in the Eco-Fortress. It was a universally acknowledged truth in Lochdebuff that a policeman's peace was only ever shattered when he was exactly 3 minutes away from consuming a perfectly cooked plate of sausages. Hamish Macbeth stood over his small, sputtering stove in the police station, gently turning 3 plump venison sausages with an old fork. The rich, savoury smell filled the cramped kitchen, completely masking the faint scent of damp dog and floor wax. Lug sat at his feet, tail giving an occasional, hopeful thump against the linoleum. Outside, the Highland rain had reduced itself to a persistent, miserable drizzle that veiled the mountains in grey mist. Just 2 more minutes, Lugs, Hamish murmured, reaching for a crusty roll, and then we shall unplug the telephone and pretend we are dead. Right on cue, the heavy black telephone in the front office began to ring. It shrilled with an urgent, demanding pitch. Hamish closed his hazel eyes and let out a long, tragic sigh. He briefly considered letting it ring, but in a village like Lochdebuff, an unanswered phone simply meant the caller would march directly to the station and hammer on the door. He reluctantly abandoned his skillet, wiped his hands on his trousers, and picked up the receiver. Lochdebuff Police Station. Constable Macbeth speaking. Hamish, you must come up to Stag Hill at once, squawked the voice of Jessie Curry, the village postmistress and self-appointed purveyor of local gossip. She sounded breathless, a rare occurrence for a woman who could talk without inhaling for minutes at a time. It's the Sassenach, the rude one with the yellow jacket. Mr. Vance, Hamish asked, his stomach giving a resentful rumble. Has he been shouting at the sheep again? Jessie, he's not shouting at anything, Hamish, Jessie cried. Archie MacLean went up there to have a word about that electric fence, and he looked through the great big silly glass window. Vance is on the floor. He's dead, Hamish. and he looks completely ridiculous." 10 minutes later, the police Land Rover groaned its way up the muddy, winding track towards Stag Hill. Hamish parked a polite distance from the newly built structure and stepped out into the freezing drizzle. Lugs trotted faithfully at his heels. Julian Vance's eco-fortress was a brutalist nightmare of black steel, reclaimed timber, and vast panes of floor, to ceiling glass that looked entirely alien against the ancient, heather-clad slopes of the glen. Archie McLean, a burly crofter with hands like shovels and a perpetual scowl, was standing on the gravel driveway, looking pale and deeply uncomfortable. "I didn't touch him, Hamish," Archie said, immediately holding up his hands. "I only came up to tell him where he could shove his electric fence, but I looked through the glass, and there he was." Hamish ambled forward, his hands deep in his pockets, adopting his most vacant, unhurried expression. "Let us have a look, Archie." He pressed his face to the cold condensation, street glass. The living room was a monument to expensive, minimalist taste. Stark white rugs, sharp-edged slate furniture, and a high-tech bio-ethanol fireplace. And right in the center of the pristine white rug lay Julian Vance. He was dead. But what made Hamish raise a single, fiery red eyebrow was the sheer indignity of it. Vance was wearing a pair of violently expensive, matching emerald green silk pajamas. A plush lavender-scented sleep mask was pushed up onto his forehead. Most bizarrely of all, his mouth was stretched wide open, and wedged firmly inside it was a large, raw, muddy turnip. "Well," Hamish murmured mildly, "that is not something you see every day." "Is he choked on it?" Archie asked, leaning over Hamish's shoulder. "Who eats a raw turnip in their silk jammies?" "Nobody entirely sane, Archie," Hamish replied. He walked around to the heavy oak front door and turned the handle. It was locked solid. Hamish peered through the window at the heavy deadbolts. "The deadbolts are thrown from the inside," he noted. He walked around the perimeter of the eco-fortress, checking the sleek modern windows and the rear patio doors. Every single entry point was sealed tight. The house was a veritable vault, locked from the inside out. Nobody could have gotten in, and nobody could have gotten out. With a weary sigh, knowing he was about to cause property damage that DCI Blair would scream about, Hamish wrapped his uniform jacket around his elbow and smashed a smaller side, pane of glass near the kitchen door. He reached in, unlocked it, and stepped inside. The air in the house was warm and smelled faintly of expensive cedar wood and damp earth. Hamish squatted beside the body, keeping lugs back with a soft command. He didn't touch the corpse, but his sharp eyes took in every detail. Vance's face was bruised purple, indicating asphyxiation, likely from the root vegetable lodged in his airway. But Hamish's gaze drifted downward. There were no signs of a struggle. Nothing was knocked over. The high-tech security panel on the wall glowed a steady, reassuring green, indicating the alarms had been set internally all night. Yet, there was one tiny inconsistency that ruined the illusion of an impossible crime. On the cuff of Vance's pristine emerald pajamas, there was a tiny, faint smear of coarse blue chalk, the exact sort of chalk used by local crofters to mark their sheep. Hamish stood up, rubbing the back of his neck. His venison sausages were undoubtedly ruined by now, and worse, a locked-room mystery with a high-profile victim meant only one thing. "Archie," Hamish sighed heavily, looking at the dead man and his turnip. "Go down to the hotel and use their phone. You'd better call Strathbane headquarters. Tell them DCI Blair is going to need a very fast car, and I am going to need a very large whiskey." Chapter 3. The Strathbane Circus and the Boiled Ham for 2 hours. Hamish Macbeth sat on a fiercely uncomfortable slate chair in Julian Vance's eco-fortress, guarding a corpse that still had a turnip jammed in its mouth. He used the time constructively. He mourned his burned venison sausages, rubbed lugs behind the ears, and meticulously committed every detail of the room to memory. He paid particular attention to that faint smear of blue crofter's chalk on the dead man's emerald silk cuff. When the wail of police sirens finally pierced the gloomy Highland quiet, Hamish stood up, stretched his long legs, and deliberately slumped his shoulders. He smoothed his hair down so it looked entirely unstyled, let his jaw slacken into a mask of supreme provincial dimness, and waited for the hurricane. The front door, which Hamish had unbolted from the inside, burst open. Detective Chief Inspector Blair of Strathbane stormed into the pristine room, bringing with him the smell of stale cigarette, smoke, cheap aftershave, and unbridled aggression. Blair was a heavy-barrel, chested man with a florid face that perpetually resembled a boiled ham on the verge of exploding. He was followed closely by Detective Jimmy Anderson, a thoroughly miserable-looking man who appeared to be nursing a monumental hangover, and a smattering of uniformed officers who immediately began tracking muddy boots across the immaculate white rugs. "Macbeth," Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the expensive glass walls. "You great, lanky streak of uselessness. What have you done to the crime scene? You smashed a window." "Aye, sir," Hamish said, his voice slow and mild. "The door was locked from the inside. I had to get in to check on the poor gentleman. He wasn't answering the bell, you see." "Don't give me that locked room nonsense, you stupid peasant," Blair spat, marching over to the body. He stopped, staring down at Julian Vance. For a brief second, even the blustering DCI was struck dumb. Is that a turnip?" "I believe it is a Swede, technically, sir," Hamish offered helpfully. "But, aye, a root vegetable." Blair's face darkened from ham, pink to a dangerous shade of plum. "I don't need a gardening lesson from a village idiot, Macbeth. Look at this mess. A wealthy London developer, dead in a ridiculous outfit, with a vegetable in his gob. The press are going to have a field day. We need this wrapped up by dinner time. Anderson, get the photographer in here." Jimmy Anderson winced at the volume of his superior's voice and shuffled toward the door. "Now," Blair sneered, turning his piggy little eyes back to Hamish, "you claim it was locked from the inside, which means you missed the obvious exit point because you've got the observational skills of a dead badger. Did you check the chimney?" "It's a bioethanol fire, sir. There is no chimney." "The air vents, then, or a hidden panel?" Blair paced around the room, angrily rattling the patio doors, all of which were firmly locked from the inside. Frustration mounted on his thick features until he glanced out the shattered window and spotted the large, brooding figure of Archie McLean, who was still standing in the freezing drizzle by the police Land Rover. Blair's eyes lit up with the malevolent joy of a lazy man who has just spotted an easy shortcut. "Who is that great, hairy brute outside?" Blair demanded, pointing a meaty finger at the glass. "That would be Archie McLean, sir," Hamish said softly, a warning bell chiming in his head. "He's a local crofter. He found the body. Well, he saw it through the window and had me called." "A crofter," Blair repeated, a nasty, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "A crofter who grows turnips. I wager. Swedes, sir. Mostly potatoes, though." "Shut up, Macbeth," Blair barked, rubbing his hands together. "It's as plain as the nose on your ugly face. The Londoner comes up here, buys the land, throws his weight around. The local savage gets his knickers in a twist over a boundary line, breaks in, stuffs a turnip down the bloke's throat to shut him up, and sneaks out." "But the doors were locked from the inside, Mr. Blair," Hamish pointed out gently. "He locked the front door and slipped out a window he closed behind him." "You half-wit. We'll find the trick to it. It's an open and shut case." Blair marched toward the door, yelling over his shoulder, "Anderson, arrest that crofter, read him his rights and throw him in the back of the car. We'll sweat a confession out of him by tea time." Hamish stood quietly by the fireplace, watching the Strathbane detectives swarm the unfortunate Archie McLean. Blair had taken the bait of the obvious suspect, exactly as Hamish knew he would. It was tragic, really, how predictable the man was. "Right, Macbeth," Blair snapped, pausing at the threshold. "You're off this case. You've done enough damage breaking the glass. Go back to your dreary little station, fill out your time cards, and direct traffic. Leave the real police work to the professionals." "Aye, sir. Just as you say, sir," Hamish murmured, dipping his head subserviently. As Blair stomped out into the rain, barking orders, Hamish slipped his hands into his pockets. His face was entirely devoid of expression, but internally he was smiling. Blair had the wrong man, the wrong motive, and he hadn't noticed the blue chalk at all. The Strathbane Circus had taken over the official investigation, which meant Hamish was now entirely free to do what he did best. He was going to wander back into Lochtabuff, find a warm fire, mooch a cup of tea, and quietly catch a murderer. Chapter 4. A stale scone, and the wrong colour of chalk. The police convoy roared back down the single-track road towards Strathbane, sirens blaring pointlessly to scatter a few disinterested sheep. Hamish Macbeth stood on the damp gravel of Stag Hill, watching them go with a profound sense of relief. DCI Blair had his prized suspect locked safely in the back of a squad car, and was already mentally drafting his press release. Left entirely to his own devices, Hamish realised his primary emotion was not a burning thirst for justice, but rather a sharp, twisting hunger. The tragic loss of his venison sausages still weighed heavily on his soul. He gave a low whistle to Lugs, and man and dog began the slow, ambling walk back down into the village of Lochtabuff. The rain had paused, leaving the air smelling of wet bracken, sea salt, and the faint, comforting tang of peat smoke from the village chimneys. Hamish bypassed the police station entirely. Official police work required paperwork, and paperwork was the enemy of a peaceful afternoon. Instead, he pushed open the door of the local post office and general store, the little brass bell above his head jingling cheerfully. The shop was a glorious jumble of tinned goods, woolen socks, and local gossip. Behind the counter stood Jessie Curry, flanked by her usual audience of 2 elderly village women. They immediately fell silent as Hamish entered, their eyes bright with predatory curiosity. "Well," Jessie demanded, leaning over the counter, her knuckles resting on a stack of local newspapers. "Is it true, Hamish? Did that great Strathbane ape actually arrest poor Archie MacLean?" "Aye, Jessie," Hamish sighed, pulling off his damp-peaked cap and running a hand through his flaming red hair. He adopted a look of wide-eyed, helpless melancholy. Mr. Blair was very firm, said it was an open and shut case. He wouldn't listen to a simple bobby like me. I've been banished from the investigation entirely. It is a disgrace," Jessie declared, slapping the counter. "Archie wouldn't kill a man. Punch him, yes. Throw him in the lock, perhaps. But murder, never. He doesn't have the attention span for it." "I know," Hamish said, mournfully leaning his tall frame against the counter. He cast a pathetic, lingering glance at the glass display case next to the till. "It has been a terrible morning. I was cooking sausages when you rang, Jessie. I haven't had a bite to eat all day, and my stomach feels like my throat's been cut." Jessie's motherly instincts, usually buried beneath a thick layer of nosiness, flared up. "You poor lamb. Sit down on that stool. I've got half a pot of tea in the back, and there is a cheese scone left from yesterday. It's a bit hard, but it'll do you." Within 2 minutes, Hamish was happily settled in the corner, with a steaming mug of strong, sugary tea and a scone that required a fair amount of jaw strength to demolish. He fed a crumbly corner to Lugs, who accepted it with a grateful snap. "So," Hamish mumbled around a mouthful of cheddar and flour, keeping his tone light and entirely unbothered. "If Archie didn't do it, I wonder who did, Mr. Vance seemed like such a charming fellow." The women scoffed in unison. "Charming," spat Mrs. Gallagher, adjusting her tartan shawl. "He was a menace. He was in the pub 3 nights ago, screaming his head off." Hamish paused, his teacup hovering an inch from his lips. "Was he now?" "Yelling at Archie. About the fence, I suppose." "No, not Archie," Jessie corrected, eager to display her superior knowledge. "He was yelling at Geordie Ross. You know Geordie did all the local stonework and the timber decking for that ugly glass box Vance built." Hamish nodded, slowly. Geordie Ross was the village handyman and builder. He was a quiet, meticulous man who took great pride in his craft. "Did they fall out?" "Fall out? Vance refused to pay him," Jessie said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Said the timber was warped, and the stone was the wrong shade of grey. Refused the final payment of £2,000. Geordie was white as a sheet, told Vance he'd rue the day he cheated a Lochtabuff man." "Is that a fact?" Hamish murmured, taking another sip of tea. His mind was racing, fitting pieces together with lethal precision. Blair had arrested Archie because Archie was a crofter, and a turnip had been the weapon of humiliation. But Hamish knew the locals better than Blair ever could. Archie McLean raised Cheviot sheep, and he marked their fleece with red raddle. Geordie Ross, on the other hand, kept a small, separate flock of blackfaces on the lower slopes, and Geordie Ross marked his sheep with a very specific, bright blue chalk, the exact shade of the faint smear Hamish had seen on the cuff of the dead man's emerald silk pyjamas. Hamish finished his tea and swallowed the last of the dry scone, feeling a warm glow of satisfaction that had nothing to do with the food. He had his suspect. He had his motive. Now, all the useless peasant of a policeman had to do was figure out how Geordie Ross had locked a dead Sassenach inside an impenetrable eco-fortress, and how to trap the builder into confessing without Strathbane ever realising Hamish had done the actual work. "Thank you for the tea, Jessie," Hamish said, standing up and settling his cap back on his head with a lazy smile. "I think I'll just go for a wee wander. You know us village bobbies. Never anything important to do." Chapter 5. The smell of fresh paint and old grudges. The walk to Geordie Ross's workshop was a long, sloggy business. The path wound behind the village, cutting through a thicket of gorse that caught at Hamish's trousers and soaked his boots in icy dew. Lugs trotted alongside, occasionally pausing to investigate a suspicious tuft of grass, his tail wagging in a slow metronomic rhythm. Geordie's workshop was a draughty, iron-roofed structure that smelled of sawdust, linseed oil, and the persistent, metallic scent of cold damp. As Hamish approached, he heard the rhythmic thwack of a wood plane. Hamish didn't announce himself with a loud greeting. He simply leaned against the doorframe, watching. Geordie was bent over a workbench, his calloused hands working with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. He was a small, wiry man with hair the colour of iron filings and a face lined with years of hard labour. "That's a fine piece of oak, Geordie," Hamish said, his voice soft and non-threatening. Geordie jumped, his plane slipping and gouging the wood. He spun around, his eyes wide and jittery. When he saw it was only Hamish, the tension in his shoulders dropped, though he didn't quite relax. "Lord, Hamish, ye nearly gave me a heart attack. What are ye doing prowling about like a ginger cat?" "Just enjoying the air," Hamish said, stepping into the workshop and letting the door shut behind him. He picked up a piece of sandpaper from the bench and started cleaning a stray splinter from his nail. "A sad business up at Stag Hill, isn't it? Though I suppose it's a bit of a relief for some." Geordie stiffened. He picked up a rag and began wiping his already clean tools. "Aye, shame about the man, but he was a piece of work. Nobody here liked him." "Including you, I hear," Hamish said, his tone still casual, almost conversational. "Jesse Curry says he wouldn't pay you for the decking." Geordie's jaw tightened. "The man was a thief. £2,000, Hamish. That's half a year's profit for my shop. I went up there to talk to him yesterday. He just laughed in my face. Told me if I wanted money, I should get a proper job. And did ye have any further words? I told him he'd regret it. I meant I'd take him to small claims court, not that I'd kill him." Geordie's voice cracked. "You don't think, Hamish, you don't think the police are coming for me, do you? They've already got Archie." Hamish sighed, walking over to a shelf filled with various pigments and marking tools. He spotted a heavy block of blue raddle, the same shade as the chalk on the dead man's sleeve. He picked it up, rolling it between his fingers. "Blair thinks Archie did it. He's simple, that one, likes things to be obvious. A turnip, a crofter, an angry row. It fits his narrative." Hamish looked at Geordie, his eyes suddenly sharp, piercing through the fog of his gormless persona. "But the room was locked, Geordie, from the inside. That's a bit of a puzzle for a simple builder, isn't it?" Geordie looked away, his gaze fixed intently on a stack of timber. "I wouldn't know anything about that." "The windows were locked," Hamish continued, his voice dropping into a low, hypnotic murmur. "And yet there's that blue chalk on Vance's cuff. A peculiar thing to find on a man who's never stepped foot in a sheep pen, unless, of course, he'd been dragged across a workbench in a dusty workshop." Geordie went deathly pale. He dropped the rag he was holding. I didn't mean for it to go that far. He called my father a drunk. He called my work peasant, shanty construction. He grabbed me by the throat, Hamish. He pushed me against the bench." Hamish stayed perfectly still, his heart thumping against his ribs. He had the confession. It was hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. He fell back, Geordie whispered, his voice trembling. He hit his head on the vice. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to be a murderer. I thought if I made it look like, I don't know, a joke, like someone had just broken in and done something silly. The locks, Geordie, Hamish pressed gently. How did you get out? The ventilation shaft, Geordie said, his eyes unfocused as he relived the nightmare. The one for the bioethanol fireplace. I took the cover off to adjust the draft the week before. I crawled out through the roof space and reset the heavy bolts from the outside with a piece of wire and some string. I'm a builder, Hamish. I know how those houses are put together. I know where the weaknesses are. Hamish felt a wave of pity for the man, but he also knew his duty. He couldn't let Archie stay in a cell for a crime he didn't commit, and he couldn't let Geordie continue to live with this terror. Geordie, Hamish said, his voice kind but firm. You've got to tell the truth, but you've got to do it properly. You have to let me handle it. If you go to Blair now, he'll have your head on a platter to save his own reputation. What are you going to do? Geordie asked, looking at Hamish as if for the first time. I'm going to set a stage, Hamish said, his eyes narrowing as he planned. And you are going to be the lead actor. It's time someone taught DCI Blair that he shouldn't be so quick to ignore the local talent. Chapter 6. The theatrical debacle at the hotel. The following afternoon, the Tommel Castle Hotel was transformed into an unlikely theatre. News of the Sassenach murder had drawn the local press like flies to honey, and DCI Blair, sensing a glorious career, defining moment, had insisted on holding a public briefing in the hotel's main lounge. The room was packed. Local shopkeepers, hotel staff, and even a few confused tourists sat on velvet chairs, watching as Blair preened in front of a whiteboard. He had already chalked up a simplistic timeline that painted Archie McLean as a vengeful, turnip-wielding maniac. Hamish stood in the back, tucked into a dark corner, his long frame hunched over a cup of tepid tea. Luggs was curled up at his feet, apparently fast asleep. Beside Hamish stood Geordie Ross, who looked as though he were awaiting an execution. Everything is set, Geordie, Hamish whispered, his voice barely audible over the drone of Blair's self-congratulatory speech. Just remember, don't look at the police, look at the people. They'll see the truth of it before the law ever does. Blair was in the middle of a particularly loud, boastful anecdote about how he had broken the suspect when he paused, squinting at the back of the room. Is that you, Macbeth? I thought I told you to go back to your station. Hamish didn't retreat. Instead, he shuffled forward, holding a crumpled piece of paper that looked suspiciously like a grocery receipt. I, sir, just thought I'd bring you this. Found it in the waste bin at the workshop this morning. I thought it was important, but since you've already solved the case, I suppose it's just rubbish. Blair's face soured. He strode over, snatched the paper from Hamish's fingers, and read it, his brow furrowed. A receipt for a high-tension wire and specialized magnets from a hardware supplier in Inverness. What is this rubbish, Macbeth? I don't know, sir, Hamish said, feigning an air of profound stupidity. It was in Geordie Ross's shop, and I noticed something odd about the ventilation cover at the Vance cottage. It had tiny little scratches on the screws, like someone had been turning them with a magnet from the outside. The room went deathly silent. Blair sneered, but his confidence flickered. The vents are too small for a man to crawl through. Everyone knows that. Aye, Hamish agreed, his voice growing slightly louder, drawing the attention of the murmuring crowd. But someone wouldn't have to crawl through. They'd only need to use the wire to hook the latch of the bolt and pull it into place from the roof. It's a bit of engineering, really clever, in a way. Geordie Ross, coached by Hamish, stepped forward, his voice trembling but clear. I didn't mean for it to happen, Mr. Blair. He hit his head. It was an accident. I didn't want to be a murderer. The effect was electric. The local reporters, who had been bored by Blair's bluster, suddenly sat bolt upright, their pens poised over their notebooks. Blair's face underwent a remarkable transformation. It went from the colour of a boiled ham to a mottled, sickly shade of grey. He looked at Geordie, then at the receipt, and then at the room full of witnesses who were now whispering and pointing. He realised with a sinking feeling that his open and shut case was collapsing in front of the press. "Are you confessing to the murder of Julian Vance?" Blair demanded, his voice cracking with panic. "I'm confessing to an accident," Geordie repeated. "As Hamish had instructed, he attacked me. I was defending myself. If you'd bothered to ask the local tradesman, instead of assuming the first crofter you saw was the killer, you would have found the truth yesterday." The murmur in the room grew into a roar. The local sentiment was entirely behind Geordie, a hard-working man pushed to the brink by an arrogant outsider. Blair looked around, seeing the trap. If he arrested Geordie for murder, he would have to admit that he had spent 24 hours harassing an innocent man, Archie McLean. He would look like a fool, and the press would eviscerate him. Hamish leaned in, his voice a smooth, treacherous whisper. "It's a tough spot, sir. You could ignore the confession and keep holding Archie, but the local papers are already writing about the wrong suspect. Or you could take the confession, treat it as a tragic case of self-defense, and look like a man who brings balance to the Highlands." Blair glared at Hamish with pure, unadulterated hatred. He knew better than anyone that the village idiot had just outmaneuvered him completely. "Fine," Blair barked, signalling his officers to take Geordie into custody. "But I'm handling the processing myself, Macbeth. You're officially suspended from all duties until I finish the report. I want you far away from this station." "Aye, sir," Hamish said, touching his cap with a mock servile gesture. "Whatever you think is best," as the police hauled a weeping Geordie toward the door, and the press scrambled to follow. Hamish stood alone in the centre of the room. He had cleared Archie, he had brought the truth to light, and he had managed to get himself suspended, which, in his books, was as good as a holiday. He looked at Lugs, who gave a soft, contented woof. "Let's go home, old lad," Hamish murmured, feeling the weight of the world lifting from his shoulders. "I believe there is still half a tin of stew in the pantry, and not a single detective in sight." Chapter 7. The unbearable quiet of a suspension. The week of Hamish's suspension was perhaps the most peaceful period he had enjoyed in years. With the official police presence retreated back to the frantic bustle of Strathbane, Lochtabus settled back into its natural, glacial pace. The rain persisted, but it seemed less like an assault and more like a gentle, rhythmic lullaby tapping against the windows of the cottage. Hamish spent his mornings doing exactly what he had spent the last decade doing, avoiding productive activity. He walked Lugs along the shoreline, watched the grey mist dance over the peaks of the Highlands, and spent long, contemplative hours sitting on the porch of his cottage, nursing a mug of lukewarm coffee and staring at nothing in particular. His neighbour, Mrs. Begg, was the only one who seemed genuinely distressed by his absence from duty. "It's a scandal, Hamish," she exclaimed one morning, leaning over her garden fence as he was busy doing nothing at all. "The post office is a hive of rumours. They say Blair is going to try to have you fired permanently. He's writing a report that makes you out to be an insubordinate menace, who sabotages criminal investigations for fun." Hamish chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that felt good in his chest. "Let him write, Mrs. Begg. The more he writes, the less time he has to come back here and bother us. But what about your pension? What about your future?" "I've got a dog, a roof, and a view of the mountains," Hamish replied, leaning back and closing his eyes. "That's a future better than any desk in the city could offer." However, even in the blissful quiet of a suspension, the life of a detective, even a reluctant one, rarely stayed dormant. On the fourth day of his holiday, Hamish was sitting in the back of the village pub, the Highland Light, nursing a glass of thin, peaty whisky. He was enjoying the silence when the heavy door swung open, admitting a gust of wind and a very familiar, very distressed face. It was Elspeth Grant. Elspeth was a beautiful, sharp-witted woman who worked for the local newspaper and had a habit of appearing exactly when Hamish least wanted to be found, but exactly when he most needed to hear the truth. She looked frazzled, her coat dampened and her hair wild from the wind. "Hamish, you're here," she cried, rushing over to his table. She didn't wait for an invitation. She simply collapsed into the chair opposite him. "Elspeth," Hamish said, offering a slow, crooked grin. "I thought you were in Edinburgh, on assignment." "I was. I came back early when I heard about the Stag Hill murder. The whole village is talking, Hamish. but not about the murder, about the aftermath. She leaned across the small wooden table, her voice dropping. Blair isn't just writing a report on you. He's digging into the property records of the entire glen. He's trying to link the accidental death of Julian Vance to a wider conspiracy of local land grabbers. Hamish frowned, the lazy glint in his eyes sharpening. A conspiracy, that's rich even for Blair. What is he looking for? He's convinced that Geordie Ross didn't act alone, Elspeth said, her eyes intense. He thinks someone encouraged Geordie to confront Vance. He's going around asking questions about every heated argument that's happened in Lochdover for the last 3 years. He's turning people against each other, Hamish. The village is split. Some think Geordie was a hero for standing up to the Sassenach. Others are terrified that the police are going to start arresting everyone for petty grievances. Hamish sighed. The peaceful week had just evaporated. Blair was doing what he did best, creating chaos where none existed, simply because he was too arrogant to admit he had been humiliated by a local builder. He's looking for a scapegoat to take the heat off his own incompetent investigation, Hamish murmured, more to himself than to Elspeth. If he can prove it was a coordinated act, he can claim that the local village culture is inherently criminal. It justifies everything he did. He's coming back tomorrow, Elspeth warned. He's bringing a team of forensic accountants and a squad of officers to sweep the area. He wants to tear apart the village, Hamish. He wants to break the spirit of this place. Hamish looked at his half-empty glass of whiskey. He looked at Luggs, who was snoring softly under the table. He thought about the pride of the crofters, the hard work of the local tradesmen, and the fragile, beautiful isolation of his home. "Tomorrow, you say?" Hamish asked softly. "Tomorrow morning, they'll start at the hotel and work their way down the row." Hamish stood up, the lazy posture falling away, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. He took a final sip of his drink and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Well," Hamish said, his voice quiet but carrying an undercurrent of iron, "if Mr. Blair wants to spend his time digging into the past, I suppose it's time I gave him something real to find. It wouldn't do to have the man wandering around unsupervised, would it?" "What are you planning, Hamish?" Elspeth asked, her voice tinged with both worry and excitement. Hamish adjusted his cap, his hazel eyes flashing with a spark of genuine mischief. "I'm going to go for a walk," he said, turning toward the door. "And by the time Mr. Blair arrives tomorrow, I think we'll find that the history of Lochdover has become far too complicated for even him to unravel." Chapter 8. The archaeology of petty grievances. The dawn broke over Lochdover with a bruised purple light that hinted at another day of relentless rain. Hamish was already out, his long legs eating up the miles as he moved through the shadows of the valley. He wasn't poaching, and he wasn't idling. He was planting. He knew exactly how DCI Blair's mind worked. It was a linear, bureaucratic trap. Blair looked for connections in ledgers, bank statements, and overheard telephone calls. He was a man of the digital age trying to solve a puzzle that lived in the blood, the soil, and the long-held grudges of 1,000 years. To stop Blair from tearing the village apart with his forensic accountants, Hamish needed to provide a distraction so vast, so ridiculously complicated, and so thoroughly local that the Strathbane police would be buried in paperwork for a month. By the time the sleek, black police cruisers rolled into the village square at 9 a.m., the atmosphere in Lochdover was unnervingly cheerful. Hamish was standing by the hotel entrance, looking entirely unbothered, as Blair stepped out, looking like a man who had not slept since the last murder. He was followed by 2 men in grey suits, the forensic accountants, who looked like they had never stepped on anything softer than a carpet. "Macbeth," Blair barked, his face contorting. "You're still here? I thought I ordered you to stay away from the village centre." "I live here, sir," Hamish said, flashing a slow, vacuous grin. "Besides, I thought I'd help. I heard you were looking for information regarding, well, everything. We are conducting a systematic audit of all business dealings related to the Vance property," Blair said, puffing out his chest. "We're going to find out who was behind the pressure on that builder. We're going to uncover the entire shadow economy of this pathetic hamlet." Well, good luck with that," Hamish murmured, pulling a thick hand-written ledger from his pocket. It was a notebook he had spent all night assembling. If you're looking for pressure and busyness deals, you'll want to talk to everyone. He handed the book to Blair. It was filled with meticulous, entirely truthful, but completely irrelevant details. The exact time Mrs. Macbeth had argued with the butcher over the price of a mutton chop in 2012, a detailed record of who had forgotten to pay their tab at the pub during the Great Storm of 2019, and a 3-page manifesto from the local gardening club regarding the invasive nature of the Sassenach's new lawn seeds. Blair flicked through the pages, his expression shifting from confusion to mounting rage. "What is this nonsense? This is just gossip." "It's local history, sir," Hamish corrected, his voice mild. "If you want to understand why Geordie reacted the way he did, you have to understand the context. Everyone in the village has a grievance with someone. If you investigate the Vance case, you have to investigate the mutton chop row, or your data won't be statistically significant. That's what the accountants will tell you, I'm sure." The accountants hovered nervously, looking at the dense, sprawling script. One of them tentatively took the book and began reading. His face paled, and Hamish added, turning to point toward the hills, "I heard you were looking for illegal activities. I've taken the liberty of marking a few spots where some of the lads have been. Let's say stretching the property boundaries for decades. If you start measuring from the old stone wall instead of the modern fence, you'll find that nearly every property in the glen is involved in a legal dispute." Blair looked at the hills, then back at Hamish, his eyes bulging. He knew what that meant. If he started a land boundary audit, he wouldn't just be looking for a murder accomplice, he would be triggering 10,000 lawsuits that would tie the Strathbane Police Department up in civil court until the end of the century. "You're trying to bury me in red tape, you ginger devil," Blair hissed, stepping into Hamish's personal space. "Me, sir," Hamish replied, his expression of wide-eyed innocence so perfect it bordered on art. "I'm just trying to be helpful. You wanted the full picture. You wanted to know who had a grudge against whom. Well, in Lochdeverth, the answer is everyone. It's the local pastime." Just then, the village postmistress, Jessie Curry, stepped out of her shop, followed by 3 of her most vocal friends. They carried trays of tea and scones, and they were smiling in a way that made Blair's blood run cold. "Oh, Constable Macbeth," Jessie called out loudly. "Are these the gentlemen who want to hear the story about the 1994 boundary dispute at the minister's house? I have all the records right here." The accountants looked at the looming, determined faces of the village women, then at the thick ledger of grievances, and finally at their boss. One of them leaned over and whispered, "Sir, if we open up these land records, we're going to need a legal team, not accountants. This could take years." Blair looked at the village, a sea of unimpressed, watchful faces. He looked at Hamish, who was gently petting lugs, looking for all the world like a man who had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to wait. The DCI let out a sound like a deflating tire. He had come to conquer, but he had arrived in a place where the history was deeper, thicker, and far more stubborn than any city detective could hope to penetrate. "Get in the car," Blair snarled to his men, his voice thick with defeat. "We're leaving." As the cruisers roared away, leaving a cloud of exhaust in the misty air, Hamish let out a long, slow breath. He turned to Jessie and nodded. "Good work, Jessie," he said quietly. "They won't be back, will they?" she asked. "Not for a long time," Hamish replied, watching the last of the taillights disappear into the gloom. "They've got a lot of reading to do." Chapter 9. The Ghost of the Eco-Fortress with DCI Blair and his team of confused, ledger-wielding accountants relegated to the status of a bad memory. Lochdeverth returned to its usual, rhythmic stillness. The damp clouds hung low, heavy with the promise of more rain, but for Hamish Macbeth, the air felt remarkably light. He was back in his cottage, enjoying the rare, golden silence of an afternoon, without a crisis. He had a pot of black coffee on the stove, and a second-hand mystery novel open on his lap. However, as the shadows lengthened across the floorboards, a persistent, rhythmic tapping at his door pulled him from his reverie. It wasn't the frantic hammering of a worried villager, but a slow, hesitant knock. Hamish stood, his joints popping, and pulled the door open. Standing on his porch was a young woman he didn't recognize. She was dressed in sharp, city slicker clothes, an expensive trench coat, and leather boots that were already ruined by the Highland mud. She looked tired, her eyes red, rimmed, and she gripped a small leather handbag as if it were a shield. "Constable Macbeth?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My name is Sarah Vance. I'm Julian's sister." Hamish didn't invite her in immediately. He looked at her, his eyes unreadable. "I'm sorry for your loss, lass. Come in, out of the damp." She sat on his narrow wooden chair, looking around the Spartan, cozy room with a mix of confusion and pity. She clearly didn't understand how a man who was supposed to be a police officer could live in such a state of organized neglect. "The police, the ones from Strathbane. They told me it was a closed case," she said, clutching a silk handkerchief. "They said it was a tragic accident involving a local worker. They told me to go home, settle the estate, and move on." "That is what they reported," Hamish said, pouring her a cup of coffee that was likely far too strong for her constitution. "But I don't believe it," she said, looking up at him. Julian was arrogant, yes. He was obsessed with his eco-fortress, but he was also a paranoid man. He had a private security system, a secondary one, that connected directly to his personal laptop, not a house system. "He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I should look at the data." Hamish didn't move. He leaned back against the counter, his hands deep in his pockets. "And did you look?" "I couldn't. His files were locked behind a biometric firewall, but I managed to get the hard drive out before the police sealed the property. I thought, maybe you could tell me what it means." She pulled a small silver external drive from her bag and slid it across the table. Hamish stared at the device. He didn't want the evidence. He wanted a quiet night. He wanted to finish his book. But as he looked at Sarah Vance's desperate face, he felt that familiar, irritating prickle of duty. "I'm not a computer man, lass," he said, though he was already pulling his own ancient dusty laptop from a cupboard. "But I know a few things about how people hide their secrets." He plugged the drive into his machine. It took a while to boot, the cooling fan humming like a distressed insect. When the files finally appeared, Hamish saw that it wasn't a log of business deals or property blueprints. It was a collection of video clips taken from a hidden camera in the fireplace. The same fireplace Geordie Ross had crawled through. Hamish opened the most recent file. It was stamped 2 nights before the murder. He watched, mesmerized, as the screen flickered with grainy, infrared footage. Julian Vance was in the room, pacing. He wasn't alone. Another figure was with him. A man, tall and broad, shouldered, wearing a dark coat and a flat cap. The audio was distorted, but the words were clear. "You're playing a dangerous game, Julian," the man said. "The land is mine," Vance spat back. "And the mineral rights under the glen are worth millions. I don't care about the historical preservation orders. I'll pave over this whole valley if I have to." Hamish felt the blood turn cold in his veins. Mineral rights. This wasn't about a £20,000 decking bill. It was about something far, far larger. The man in the flat cap leaned forward. "If you go ahead with this, the village will lose everything. The water table, the grazing rights, the way of life. You won't walk out of here, Julian." The footage ended abruptly. Hamish closed the laptop, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. "This man," she whispered. "Do you recognize him?" Hamish nodded slowly. It wasn't Geordie Ross. It was someone far more influential, someone who had been helping the village navigate the planning permission for the eco-fortress from the very start. "Aye," Hamish said, his voice hard. "I recognize him. And I think I know why Geordie really killed your brother. It wasn't just a row over money. He was being used, Sarah, and he doesn't even know it yet." The peace of the evening was well and truly dead. Hamish sighed, stood up, and grabbed his coat. "Stay here, lass. Lugs will look after you. I'm going to go have a word with the man who really owns the soul of this glen." Chapter 10. The Architect of Shadows. The rain was lashing against the windshield of the Land Rover as Hamish drove toward the outskirts of Lochdebuff, where the sleek, modern manor of Sir Alistair McIntyre sat perched on the cliffs. Sir Alistair, the local landowner, the man who had facilitated the sale of Stag Hill, and as the infrared footage had just revealed. A man with a very specific interest in what lay beneath the soil of the glen. Hamish didn't bother with a warrant. He didn't even bother with the front gate, instead pulling the Land Rover into the shadows of a thicket of pine trees and walking the rest of the way. He knew the groundskeeper, a man named Angus who spent more time sleeping in the greenhouse than guarding the property, would be tucked away in his shed. He slipped through the side garden door, which, as usual, was unlocked. Hamish moved with the silent grace of a predator, his long, lanky body blending into the dark mahogany, panelled corridors of the manor. He didn't need to look for his target. He could hear the steady, rhythmic clink of glass against decanter coming from the study. Hamish pushed the door open, without knocking. Sir Alister was seated in a leather armchair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, his eyes fixed on the fire. He looked up, his face showing no shock, only a tired, aristocratic boredom. "I was wondering when you would find your way here, Macbeth," Sir Alister said, gesturing with his glass to a chair. "You have a habit of being inconveniently intelligent for a man of your station." "Mineral rights, Sir Alister," Hamish said, remaining standing. His voice was low, devoid of his usual lazy drawl. "You told the village that Vance was building an eco-fortress for the sake of the environment. You even convinced the planning board it was a green project. But it was a cover for a deep-bore survey, wasn't it?" "A man of vision sees potential where others see only rocks and heather," Sir Alister said, taking a sip of his drink. "Vance was a useful idiot. He had the money to buy the land, and the arrogance to ignore the locals, which made him the perfect lightning rod. I just needed to push him a little, to make sure he pressed the local government until they gave us the mineral extraction permits. And when he got greedy, when he realized the value, and decided he didn't need you anymore," Sir Alister smiled. It was a cold, thin expression. Geordie Ross was always the loose thread. A volatile, angry little man with a chip on his shoulder and a pride that outstripped his income. It was quite easy, really. I mentioned to him that Vance was mocking his work, that he had no intention of paying, and that he was planning to bulldoze the workshop to expand the site. Geordie was a weapon waiting to be fired. Hamish took a step forward, his hand slipping into his pocket to touch the small digital drive. "You played him. You made him think he was standing up for his village, when all he was doing was clearing the way for your company to come in and turn this valley into an open-pit mine. And who would believe you, Constable?" Sir Alister stood up, his height giving him an air of dangerous authority, a suspended policeman with a reputation for being a drunk and an idiot. "You have no evidence, and your only witness is currently being processed for murder." Hamish pulled the drive from his pocket and held it up. "I have the footage, Sir Alister, the hidden camera in the fireplace. Vance recorded your meeting. He didn't trust you either." Sir Alister's expression flickered. For the first time, a shadow of fear crossed his face. He lunged, moving with surprising speed for a man of his age, aiming for the drive. Hamish didn't fight like a policeman. He fought like a man who had grown up brawling in the Highland rain. He sidestepped the attack, tripped the older man with a quick movement of his foot, and pinned him against the heavy oak desk. He didn't use handcuffs. He used the sheer, lanky weight of his frame, pushing Sir Alister's face into the wood. "You're done, Sir Alister," Hamish breathed into the man's ear. "The police from Strathbane are useless, and Blair is a fool, but they aren't deaf. When they see this, the entire investigation into Geordie changes. They'll have to consider coercion, entrapment, and murder by proxy." "You'll never get out of this house," Sir Alister hissed. "You'd be surprised," Hamish said. He hauled the man up, retrieved his phone, and dialed a number he had been avoiding for weeks. His own station's line, which was now being answered by a junior officer in Strathbane, who, unlike Blair, actually respected the law. "Constable Macbeth here," Hamish said, his voice steady. "I have a confession, and I have the evidence. And I think you'd better send a car that isn't driven by DCI Blair. I've had quite enough of him for one lifetime." As he held the line, looking out at the dark, stormy mountains, Hamish felt a strange, quiet contentment. The village would be saved, the mines would never come. And as for himself, he would likely be reprimanded, questioned, and perhaps even forced to endure a formal commendation. He looked down at his muddy boots and the tired, disgraced man beneath him. It was a hell of a way to ruin a perfectly lazy week. But as he heard the distant, hopeful sound of a siren cresting the hill, Hamish Macbeth allowed himself a small, weary smile. He was going to stay in Lockdove, even if he had to arrest the entire aristocracy to do it. Chapter 11. The promotion that never was the aftermath of the Macintyre affair was as messy as a Highland bog after a week of torrential rain. Within 48 hours, the truth had trickled out, fueled by enough scandal to keep the village pubs roaring for a decade. Sir Alistair McIntyre was in a holding cell in Inverness, his dreams of mineral riches shattered by a grainy video and a stubborn policeman who refused to stay hidden. Geordie Ross, though still facing charges for the assault on Vance, was granted a dramatic reduction in bail, with the full weight of the Crown's prosecution now redirected toward the man who had manipulated him. DCI Blair, however, was the real victim of the situation, forced to admit that his primary suspect had been a pawn and that a useless village bobby had not only solved the mystery, but done so while under suspension. He had retreated into a sulking silence that was heard all the way to Strathbane headquarters. Hamish sat in the back room of the Lockdove police station, his feet propped up on his desk. He was nursing a mug of tea that was mostly sugar, and if he were being honest, a very healthy splash of his favourite malt whisky. The front door chimed. Hamish groaned. He had hoped for at least a week of administrative silence before the world started demanding things from him again. The door opened, and in walked a chief superintendent from regional headquarters, a tall, severe woman named Miller, who looked like she hadn't smiled since the mid-90s. Hamish stood up, attempting to look professional, though his uniform tunic was missing its bottom button, and his tie was knotted with the precision of a loose piece of twine. Chief Superintendent, I wasn't expecting company, clearly, Constable, Miller said, her gaze sweeping over the peeling wallpaper and the piles of dusty paperwork on his desk. She turned her eyes on Hamish, her expression unreadable. You've caused quite a stir. The local press is calling you the sleuth of the Sea Lock, and the regional board is currently debating how to reconcile your, shall we say, non-traditional methods with the official police code of conduct. Hamish swallowed hard. This was it, the promotion, the transfer, the life in a high-rise office, in a city that smelled of bus, exhaust, and despair. He braced himself, his heart sinking. I only did what was necessary, ma'am, he said, his voice as humble and rustic as he could manage. I'm just a simple village bobby. I like my quiet. I'm not really cut out for the big leagues. I'd probably get lost in a city, or accidentally lock myself in an evidence locker. Miller stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. She studied his face, the slightly vacant expression, the gentle, unthreatening demeanour. She looked at the file on his desk, which was currently serving as a coaster for his tea. There are those who think you should be commended, Macbeth. A move to the CID in Glasgow, a steady climb up the ladder. You have an instinct for this work that is frankly irritating. Hamish felt his soul shrivel. Glasgow. The word tasted like iron and smoke. Oh, I couldn't, ma'am. Truly, I'm just not officer material. I'm quite lazy, really. I nap in the afternoons. Sometimes I forget to file the monthly reports until 3 months later. I'd be a liability to any department that wanted, well, efficiency. Miller stood in the silence for a long, agonizing minute. She looked around at the damp, cramped, utterly miserable little office. She looked at the rain lashing against the window, the faded portrait of the Queen on the wall, and the large sleeping mongrel in the corner, who was currently twitching as he dreamt of rabbits. You are, without a doubt, the most infuriating individual I have ever encountered in 20 years of service, she said, her voice dry. I've been told that, ma'am. Hamish agreed helpfully. Very well, she sighed, closing the file she was holding. I have discussed this with the board. Since you have expressed such a passionate desire to remain in Lockdove, and since your inefficiency is, according to the local population, the only thing keeping this village from total anarchy, we have decided to leave you right where you are. Hamish felt the tension bleed out of his shoulders. He nearly wept with relief. However, she continued, her eyes sharp, you are officially on probation. If I hear one more word about you, accidentally, solving a major crime while suspended, or if you ever send me another ledger filled with the shopping habits of the local minister, I will personally see to it that you are transferred to a desk job in the most boring police station in the Highlands. Yes, ma'am, of course, ma'am. It won't happen again, ma'am, Hamish said, his voice ringing with forced sincerity. Good. She turned on her heel and marched toward the door, pausing only to look at the rain-drenched street outside. I truly do not understand what you see in this place, Macbeth. It's the view, ma'am, Hamish said, watching her leave. And the tea. As the door clicked shut, Hamish sat back down and let out a long, shuddering breath. He reached over, picked up his lukewarm tea, and raised it in a toast to the empty room. Lugs opened one eye, thumped his tail once against the floor, and went back to sleep. Outside, the Highland wind resumed its mournful, beautiful song, and the mist began to roll back over the mountains. The world was cold, wet, and miserable. Hamish Macbeth was home. Chapter 12. A quiet pint and the smell of rain. The storm had finally broken, leaving the Highlands bathed in that peculiar, shimmering light that only appears after 3 days of torrential Highland rain. The mountains were deep, bruised purples and mossy greens, and the surface of the loch was as still as a sheet of hammered silver. In the village of Lochdebuff, the rhythm of life had clicked back into place, as if it had never been interrupted by murder, corporate conspiracy, or the heavy-handed arrival of the Strathbane Constabulary. The post office was back to worrying about the upcoming village bake-off. The minister was back to complaining about the lack of attendance at the Wednesday evening prayer group, and the sheep were back to wandering wherever they pleased, oblivious to the property deeds of London developers. Hamish Macbeth sat on the weathered bench outside the Highland light, his long legs stretched out, his worn boots resting on the damp flagstones. He had a glass of cold beer in one hand and a packet of salt and vinegar crisps in the other. Lugs was splayed out in the sun, his belly exposed to the light, snoring with the sort of profound unearned confidence that only a dog can possess. The village was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that felt like an old friend. Thought I might find you here, a soft voice said. Hamish looked up. Priscilla Halberton. Smythe was standing there, looking impossibly elegant even in a simple wax jacket and Wellington boots. She had just returned from a trip to London, and she carried with her the faint, sharp scent of city sophistication that always seemed to clash, and yet somehow fit, with the rugged landscape of the glen. "Hello, Priscilla," Hamish said, gesturing to the empty space on the bench. "I was just doing a bit of professional surveillance. Watching the sheep, checking the perimeter, the usual." Priscilla sat down, her posture perfect. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, looking for the lines of stress that surely should have been there after the last 2 weeks, but she found only the usual calm mask of the village policeman. "I heard the news about Sir Alistair," she said, her voice dropping. "It's all over the papers, in the city. They're calling it the Highland Reckoning. They're even comparing you to some sort of rogue, neo-traditionalist, detective." Hamish shuddered, nearly dropping his crisps. "Don't say that, Priscilla, please. If the papers keep saying things like that, I'll never get a moment's peace. They'll be sending journalists here to interview the sheep." Priscilla laughed, a bright, clear sound that made a group of gulls overhead wheel and dive. "You really do loathe the attention, don't you? Most men would be basking in it." "Attention brings people," Hamish said, looking out at the mountains. "People bring rules, rules bring reports, and reports, as you well know, are the death of a good life." "Well," she said, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a small foil, wrapped parcel, "I brought you something from the city, a bit of comfort for your hardship." Hamish unwrapped it. It was a high-quality, dark chocolate truffle, imported from a shop that certainly didn't exist in Lochdebuff. He popped it into his mouth and let his eyes close, savouring the richness. "Better than a bacon roll," she teased. "It's a different kind of happiness," Hamish admitted, "but it's missing the grease." They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun dip lower, casting long, golden shadows across the village square. There was no need for talk. They had known each other long enough to appreciate the comfort of a shared view. In a way, the murder had changed things. The village felt a little more fragile than it had a week ago. They had seen that the outside world could reach into their quiet glen and try to tear it apart for the sake of a few £1 million of mineral rights. But they had also seen that the village could push back. They had seen that someone like Hamish, who they thought was just a lazy red-headed Bobby, was, in fact, a wall against which the world's greed would break. "You're staying, then?" Priscilla asked eventually, her voice softer than usual. Hamish looked at his dog, then at the village, then at the vast, uncaring, beautiful sky. He thought about the mountain air that filled his lungs every morning, the way the light hit the peaks in the winter, and the absolute perfect lack of a career ladder. "I'm staying," he said. "Good." She stood up, smoothing her coat. "I have a meeting at the estate tonight, but I thought maybe you'd like to join me for dinner on Saturday. I promise no talk of murder, no talk of reports, and definitely no talk of mineral rights." Hamish smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached his eyes. "I'd like that, Priscilla, very much." As she walked away, her footsteps clicking on the stone, Hamish leaned back and finished his beer. The sun was gone now, the air turning crisp and cold. He whistled to Lugs, who scrambled to his feet, shaking the dust from his fur. They walked slowly back to the police station. The lights were coming on in the cottages, each one a warm, golden promise of a hearth and a kettle. Hamish locked his door, threw a handful of peat on the fire, and sat down in his armchair. He was tired, he was content, and for the first time in a long time, there was absolutely nothing left for him to do. He closed his eyes, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of the sea, and allowed himself the luxury of a very long, very peaceful sleep.